Back in 1966, if you would question my mother, my father, my teachers as to what I would be doing for a living some 50 years later, there is no way any of them would have guessed that I would have been an administrative law judge in the employ of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. You see, Mr. Toastmaster, fellow Toastmasters, welcome guest, back in 1966, I was caught up in the quadruple P, the Predictively Punitive Prevarication paradigm. It was math that put me there, math that brought me low, and math that took me down previously undiscovered paths. You see, I was not a stellar sixth grade student. If to be stellar is to be bright and glowing, I was pretty much exactly the opposite. I was dim and dull. And my dimness shone brightest when it came to math. Now, this was probably due to a general lack of mathematical acumen. Couple that with laziness and a certain amount of, how shall we say, inconsistency in submitting my homework. And by the second grading period, my math grade had dipped to depths previously unknown by man. My teacher, Mrs. Kirkwood, was a dedicated educator. And when she saw one of her students performing at a level that she felt to be well below his or her potential, it offended her sensibilities. So offended was she by my performance that she did the only thing she felt she could. She ratted me out to my mom and dad. That woman gave me a quicker than a crack addict in the backseat of a police car gives up his dealer. My parents, they were not amused. Their lack of amusement led them to put me on lockdown. And it was a severe lock. I personally thought it was very unfair. It was a severe lockdown. They took away every single privilege I enjoyed. I couldn't ride my bike, couldn't hang out with my friends, couldn't talk on the phone, couldn't watch TV, couldn't go outside. I could do nothing, absolutely nothing I enjoyed, until I had proved to my parents beyond a reasonable doubt that I had completed my homework. I have to say, grudgingly, but I do have to say that my parents' obsessive and excessive, at least in my mind, oversight did produce the desired effect. My grade began to climb. And when my grade began to climb, my parents began to give me a little bit more wiggle room. And into that wiggle room, you guessed it, crept the aforementioned laziness and inconsistency. And my grade began to drop. I may not have been the brightest star in the sky, the sharpest tool in the drawer, but I knew I was bright enough and sharp enough to know that if my grade dipped far enough, my parents were going to put me back on lockdown. And I did not want that to happen. Now, the logical, practical thing to do here would have been simply to go back and do my homework. I chose another route. I began to borrow the homework of a friend of mine. Now, had this borrowing been done with my friend's foreknowledge and consent, it probably wouldn't have been that big a deal. It was not. And when he became aware that his homework was disappearing on a fairly consistent basis, he became much more careful in guarding it, thereby cutting off my supply. Here again, I had an opportunity to do the right thing, to choose the high road. I chose another route. I decided to borrow the homework of a second classmate. If you were asking yourselves at this moment if this story is going to turn out well for me, it is not. It all began to fall apart the morning I borrowed the second classmate's, let's call her Kathy's, homework. When Mrs. Kirkwood called for homework that morning, I told her I had left mine at home, hoping that she would allow me to bring it the following day. No such luck. She ordered me to go home and get it right away. This is not a problem, not a really big problem anyway. I lived across the street. All I had to do was run across the street, copy the homework, go back, give it to Mrs. Kirkwood, it was all good. I was about halfway through when the phone rang. It was, you guessed it, Mrs. Kirkwood ordering my immediate return to the school. I was in trouble. I had only copied about half the homework. And there was no way I could take the homework back half in Kathy's handwriting, and half in mine. Ladies and gentlemen, this was the point of no return. Actually, this was the point where I should have returned. I should have gone back to the school and come clean to Mrs. Kirkwood. I could have told her the truth. Not the whole truth, of course. I certainly couldn't tell her I borrowed Kathy's homework. But I could have gone back and said, Mrs. Kirkwood, I didn't do my homework. I was hoping to be able to get it done, so forth and so on. But I chose another route. I very hurriedly and haphazardly erased Kathy's name from the top of the paper, scrawled my name in its place, and turned it in as my homework. Nothing happened. No recriminations, no shouting, nothing. I'd gotten away with it. Gotten away with it clean. Or so I thought. Report card day and the second 9 weeks was a student holiday. Why? Because teachers spent the entire day in parent-teacher conferences giving the parents their students' homework. It is amazing how in situations of extreme stress, previously forgotten details come crashing back to the forefront of your mind. One such detail, I had never gotten that homework back. And I knew when my mom and dad got home, they were going to have that paper in their hand. Imagine yourselves, ladies and gentlemen, an 11-year-old boy looking out the front door of your house, seeing your mom and dad walking across the street and knowing your life expectancy had dwindled to something around 1 minute. When my mom and dad walked through the door, they ordered my sisters out the house, ordered me upstairs, and they put me on trial. It was not a fair trial. It was not before a jury of my peers. I did not have legal representation. My parents put me on trial and they found me guilty. And they sentenced me to restriction, a restriction that was so severe, I do not believe it has ever been rescinded. And since both my parents have gone the way of all the earth, I do not expect that I will make parole. Mr. Toastmaster.